It's the week ending Saturday the 31st of August, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen Boris Johnson proroguing Parliament just ahead of the Brexit deadline, a NASA astronaut investigated for what could be the first crime in space, and KFC testing out a new line of vegan nuggets. But we're here to bring you some of the stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Arion McNicoll. Let's unwrap the week. And with Ollie still away joining me today from the week's digital team, we have Rebecca Gillie and Cameron Tait. And from our sister publication, Money Week, it's John Stepek. But to start the show this week, it's Cameron. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
Every breath you take, every move you make, every lamppost you break, they'll be watching you.
U2 is creating the building blocks for a smart city of the future, where facial recognition is part of everyday life. This could even extend to detecting what people are thinking.
Facial recognition, they can read people's emotions, and we are actually now working on these innovative demonstrations and technology.
But the Chinese government has plans to use this new biometric technology to cement its authoritarian rule.
That was a clip from China, Facial Recognition and State Control from The Economist, which is available to stream online now. Cam, a recurring refrain for this podcast is technology, friend or foe. What is it this week?
Obviously, we've got the ongoing protests in Hong Kong over the controversial extradition bill. And obviously, we're seeing quite a lot of disruption on the streets. But what I found particularly interesting is that videos have emerged this weekend of protesters chopping down lampposts, which seems strange on the surface, but they believe that these lampposts contain facial recognition software and that they are being tracked by them.
And are they right?
Well, according to the government, no. Right. The government says that they are just used to monitor traffic, and they're also used to monitor the weather as well. However, there's a lot of lampposts that have cropped up in quite a concentrated area. So if you were just monitoring weather, why would you need 40 lampposts on a street that are doing that?
And it's not just China, of course, it's elsewhere. We have actually seen facial recognition technology hitting the streets. Whether or not these lampposts actually do contain those cameras that have that software, it does exist elsewhere.
Well, this is what's quite the hypocrisy of it all, really, is that we're seeing quite a strong backlash from Western keyboard warriors that are saying, in active support of these protesters, and saying that it's wrong to be monitoring people on the streets. But if you go down to King's Cross, they're allegedly doing it already. There's also plans to install them in Canary Wharf. We've also had proposals in Canada to install a Google Smart City that will use facial recognition to track you. So this isn't a problem that's exclusive to the Greater China region. It's a problem that's going across the world.
And of course, Rebecca, you know, people are saying that they're worried about this technology, but at the same time, they're perfectly happy to be on CCTV cameras. What's the difference here?
I mean, there is some degree of difference, obviously, you know, in that facial recognition cameras would be able to, theoretically, would be able to pull up a whole profile on you and who you are and what you do, etc., you know, at a moment's notice. But it's really just about acceptance. Probably if CCTV cameras had never existed and now they were suddenly introduced, there would probably be a similar backlash. But we have all just become accustomed to CCTV cameras everywhere. The difference this time around might be that we are more organised online and that there maybe is more of an awareness of the risks of allowing technology to invade our privacy. You know, we've seen with GDPR, and the EU generally has been quite strong in pushing back against companies who are invading our privacy, using our data, etc. So maybe this time around there will be more organised resistance, but whether that's enough to actually stem the tide of these technologies flooding in remains to be seen.
Right, because of course, you know, it's not facial recognition as such that people are objecting to elsewhere. It exists on Apple iPhones, say. Have you used them, John?
No, actually, not from any particular issues with privacy, although actually now that you mention it, yeah, maybe thinking about it, maybe it is that. I mean, I think one of the problems with facial recognition contrasting with CCTV is that anyone who knows anything about kind of like the police investigations and the things like that have either been helped or hindered by CCTV is that a lot of the time either they're not working or it's one board security guard. I mean, they have so much volume of data that there is no way that you can use that. You might live in a surveillance state, but nobody's actually watching the footage. The problem with facial recognition is that you're there. It's like if you're on a blacklist somewhere, be that corporate or government, then you can get picked up immediately. The problem with this is that you're right. I mean, the technology's happening. It's going to keep happening. And really the only safeguard we then have is like, well, what do we allow our leaders, our elites, our corporations to actually then do with that?
And in fact, last week we were discussing the ways that mobile phone signal data gets used in court cases. There are obvious problems with that in how it's used, and something like facial recognition software could provoke similar kinds of problems, right? So part of the concern is to see how it gets applied when it gets applied.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, with all technologies, there is that. There's always gaps, there's always errors, and facial recognition software can still be fooled in lots of different ways. But I think it is the authoritarian thing. I mean, there was a good example like earlier this year when the police in London were testing it out in a street, and some guy said, well, no, I'm going to cover my face because I don't want to be recognised, and they arrested him and fined him 50 quid. That goes against certainly our understanding in Britain of what civil society should be. You shouldn't be allowed to get pulled over by someone simply for wanting to conceal your identity.
Cameron?
I guess the idea with CCTV, which is, I mean, we are one of the most monitored countries in the world. With CCTV, it's more of a reference rather than an actual piece of data. So essentially what you could do is, let's say I'm a criminal and I've decided to commit a crime. And they could essentially take my profile, upload it to this server, a government server, and anytime I enter an area, I could essentially get picked up on a system. You could then get a human moderator to look at it and they go, yes, he's no good, let's kick him out, which is something that you don't really have with CCTV. And at the end of the day, it's up to how people use this data. So in China and in Hong Kong particularly, the fear is in Hong Kong that if you're caught protesting, then you may be penalised for it.
You know, in China, this ties into the social score system that they have there, which is often kind of misreported and wrongly inflated in the West to be more than it is. It's not really hugely different from the blacklists that we have in the West, you know, corporate blacklists, etc. But the idea is that this could all be tied into a system. So if you were spotted at an anti-government protest, that then could be put onto your social score, and that could then give you trouble having a job, trouble traveling, etc. And so it could all tie into this giant monitoring system.
And according to the full video of that Economist piece that we listened to at the top of this section, this isn't science fiction, actually. You know, the facial recognition software is being used in China already to name and shame people who have committed crimes, and even really simple crimes. Things as minor as jaywalking or stealing loo paper were mentioned in the Economist piece. The concern is, and you can see why Hong Kong students were worried about it, that technology is going to be rolled out further.
Well, what's really quite interesting to come off at the back of that point is, so if you want, China's equivalent of Facebook is called WeChat. With the issues that are going on at the moment, there have been reports of people posting images of the protests in Hong Kong and them not being sent properly. Some accounts are even getting locked out, and to unlock their account, they have to scan their face. Why do you think that's happening? There's nothing to say, we will put you onto a server and log your details, but that very much is a case of you've been causing, I think they say, spreading misinformation. You've been spreading misinformation. We're going to take a look at your face in case you do it again.
I mean, apart from tearing down cameras as they're doing in Hong Kong, or covering your face as some people have been doing in London to try to fight back against this technology, what can people do to opt out?
In China, particularly in the major cities, as far as I understand, it's so integral that it might be quite hard to back out of it. And it really is the case. And the attitude in China of, if you've got nothing to hide, then you have nothing to fear. So it's kind of the convenience of having facial recognition, in a sense, outweighs the negative aspects of it. If it's kind of ingrained in your culture and your way of life, then I personally don't think there's a lot that you can do. Over here, In the West, it's a little bit easier because, I mean, you can prevent your smartphone from using facial recognition software. You can just use a PIN to get into it. But still, again, walk around London, there'll be facial recognition systems around.
And plenty of technologies are obviously limited to people who have the opportunity to opt in. Your Facebook data isn't collected when you're a child because you can't join Facebook until you reach a certain age. What about kids in this case who will presumably be swept up in these sorts of systems? Are children, or is the protection of children going to be particularly relevant in facial recognition?
I would think so. And but I think you've sort of hit the nail on the head. It's the lack of opt-in that is a really big issue here. I think it's a mistake to draw too much equivalence between China and the West. China is authoritarian and it's a dictatorship. So when that's not something that we want to have over here, maybe the Chinese are used to it, but I certainly am not interested in having a kind of authoritarian dictatorship over here. And the two things are very different. A lot of it is about how the government, which is ultimately us, takes charge of these technologies. And like I said, the issue is that it's very difficult to opt out. And often where these things actually do hit a brick wall in the UK is over the treatment of kids. The similar thing with kind of ID cards. It's people not wanting their children's data to be on a publicly accessible database for absolutely, valid reasons. Yeah, I'd kind of hope that would be at least one area where people would be a fight back.
And I just think the current regulations are just so thin that when you look into them, they're really just not fit for purpose if this technology continues to become more widespread. At the moment, the EU law, so obviously including the UK for the time being, is that facial recognition can be used as long as people are made aware that it's being used and they can find out what the data is being used for. But if you think about it, it's not like you turn up at the soft play centre and they say, by the way, we take photos and put them on the website. Fill in this form if that's a problem. It was being trialled at King's Cross Station. Well, you can't decide you're not going to use King's Cross Station. If you need to go somewhere, you don't really have a choice. So the illusion of choice really just doesn't bear up to any scrutiny if this is going to become used in, in public places.
And yet the usual way that people come at justifying these sorts of technologies, and the reason that we sometimes see them actually get rolled out, is because people go, look, I'm doing nothing wrong. And so in fact, it doesn't matter if this technology is rolled out broadly, and if it can, for example, help to prevent terrorism or crime or any sort of public disorder, then maybe it's a good thing. Is that not the case here? Aren't we going to encounter that sort of relaxed whatever? It doesn't affect me.
Yeah, and I think there are some real advantages, which in a way are a bit more tangible than the disadvantages. The disadvantages, are quite theoretical at the moment. But if you were selling this to, like the electorate at large, you could easily use examples like imagine if your child was kidnapped and we could pick them up immediately. We could spot them somewhere where their abductor's taken them. We could dispatch people to the scene straight away. And terrorism, someone comes up who's on a terrorism watch list. Oh, they're in a crowded place. They look suspicious. Send someone in. There are some quite stimulating examples you could use of practical ways that the technology could actually save lives. So
Cam, do the benefits potentially outweigh the concerns, the privacy concerns?
I'm a bit of a privacy advocate, but in this instance, I think that you would have to commit quite a serious crime to be detected on a facial recognition system and then someone chasing you because of it. Let's say if I've robbed a Tesco, right? If I walk through King's Cross, the police aren't going to bother running after me because I'm a petty criminal. It's only if I was perhaps on the terrorist watch list that might be a better option. And it's so much clearer than CCTV, which is what we have at the moment. CCTV is, like you were saying, John, earlier, is completely outdated. So a lot of it doesn't work now. There are huge benefits. It just depends on which side of the privacy fence that you fall. And I would say as well, if you are more of a privacy-focused person, there are a lot of instances where, because we are under the EU at the moment, our privacy is, we do have quite a lot of privacy rights. But I know that the UK is known for really pushing its luck with privacy, again, trying to monitor everyone's internet, which is something that Amber Rudd tried to do a couple of years ago, and that was immediately blocked for human rights. I don't think we're completely innocent in this.
Well, I can read from all your facial data that that's enough of this subject. So next up, it's Rebecca after this. Rebecca, what should this week be remembered for?
Well, there are 4 of us, so we're only a dog and a bottle of ginger beer away from a ripping adventure.
Someone like Enid Blyton, she didn't just do incredible things. She was, as a woman, I have huge admiration for her. She was a prolific writer, wrote brilliant books.
She got a generation to read.
Introduced millions of kids to read.
That's not true. Kids read what they are given. This is part of the problem. The schools give these books, parents buy these books. You give your kid anything.
You try reading
stories. You can't deny these.
She
percolated children's interest in reading.
I can say that my kids are avid readers and none of them have ever read Enid Blyton. You give a kid something to read, they're going to read it. And you could have done it without Enid Blyton. That's what
I have to say that I thought
That was Amanda Platel and Kehinda Andrews speaking this week on Good Morning Britain. Rebecca, good old, friendly old Enid Blyton. What's the story here?
So the story you may have seen this week is that the Mail on Sunday obtained the minutes of a Royal Mint meeting in which they were discussing plans to issue a commemorative coin to mark the 50th anniversary of Enid Blyton's death. And they ultimately decided to do away with the idea because she was, quote, racist, sexist, homophobic in her work, and that it would be basically not necessarily that they disapproved, but that they thought it might provoke a public backlash. And of course, the publication of this story has in its turn created the counter backlash to the imaginary backlash, with people weighing in, as we heard in that clip. The reason that I've brought it to us today is that I think it offers a really interesting perspective on the whole debate around, cancel culture, because we've discussed this before on this podcast, problematic artwork, should we be allowed to enjoy it, etc. But with Enid Blyton, it's a bit of a different case because she's well known to have not been technically a great writer.
Yes, that's definitely the case. And in fact, she nevertheless is the world's 4th most translated writer. She continues to sell masses of books. So kind of despite her deficiencies, she's still immensely popular, right?
Yeah, and I think it kind of opens an interesting conversation because you can't really defend, say you were going to, buy an Enid Blyton book for a child of your acquaintance, you can't really say, well, it's worth overlooking this sexist part or, this troublesome character because, it's going to teach your child to appreciate great literature or it's going to introduce them to all these new words. And, Enid Blyton had not herself personally, but in her work for children, quite a limited vocabulary. So you certainly can't come in with that argument that it's worthwhile for kids in that sense, but kids still do flock to the books.
Yeah. So, John, if her work is limited and if it also has things that we now find problematic that maybe they didn't when the books were first published, why do these books stand the test of time? Why do kids continue to love them?
I mean, there's a whole can of worms in the whole topic, but I remember reading Enid Blyton when I was a kid, but I read a lot of Famous Five books and stuff like Up the Faraway Tree, and I must admit, I can't really remember anything about them. I know I was quite a big fan, and also it kind of baffles me, because I remember reading a Secret Seven book and thinking, I didn't like that one. But then reading all the Famous Five books and you're like, wait a minute, what was the difference? Do you know what I mean? There was 2 people shot, was that it? So, yeah, it's a bit...
There's always a divide because the Secret Seven were very middle-class children because they all lived at home and attended a day school. I think that separates your Secret Sevens from your Famous Fives,
So what were the Famous Five?
The Famous Five, they were all at boarding school.
Oh, okay,
and so
right.
they would have these slightly more upper middle-class adventures. But it's funny because when I was researching this topic, I thought, well, I'll flick through one of my old Famous Fives and see if I can spot all of the, problematic content with fresh eyes. And I started reading it, and I read the whole thing from start to finish. I just sat there, pacing through the pages. And even at the time, I was thinking, what am I doing? Why am I doing this? There's something that's still so compelling about Enid Blyton's work. And I think a lot of it is, especially today, I think it's this idea of independence. These are kids who, at the start of the books, I think the oldest is 12 and the youngest is 10, going off on bicycles, they're going on boats all by themselves, having all these adventures. And I think there is something very, liberating about this world where the kids are very self-directed and they're kind of at the heart of all of their own adventures without, adults hovering over them.
Okay, I'm projecting forward to a future where you have some as yet hypothetical children. Would you allow them to read Enid Blyton? Would you actively want them to read Enid Blyton?
Well, this will come as a surprise to many of our listeners, but I've never actually read an Enid Blyton book.
What?
And to such an extent that when everyone was talking about Famous Five, I had no idea that Enid Blyton had written The Famous Five.
God.
I very much grew up on Top Gear. But if I were to have children, I would be perfectly happy with them to read it. Of kind of what I have read up, I would maybe point out to my kids if there were some things that aren't quite 2019.
John, you can probably weigh in here. You have non-hypothetical children.
Yeah.
Any Blyton in your house?
I'm sure they might have read one in the early days, and I think up the Faraway Tree, because that was like very young kids. But again, I struggle to remember a lot about it. Obviously, she's got lots of properly cancelled bits, which are reflective of the time. And there is also, she has like a really foul attitude in a lot, especially the boarding school books, where like Mallory Towers and stuff like that, where basically the girls are all picking on one awful foreigner or one awful kind of like lower class girl or whatever, and that's seen as somehow a good thing. So there's lots of bad values in it.
I actually say that some of those parts are probably even more toxic, because I think if you were reading, if you sort of flicked through it before you gave it to your kid, if you saw something that was really obviously sexist, then you might take the opportunity to talk about that with them. But when you actually look, especially the Mallory Towers ones, just awful, the girls are constantly sitting in the common room talking about who ought to be taken down a peg, and then they sort of launch this attack on them in front of everyone and just really like cut them down to size, and then they all pat themselves on the back that they've sort of improved the other person's character by exposing their flaws in this horrible manner. And even in the Famous Five, reading through it, the amount of times that they call one another idiot. Like George will be crying about something and Julian will be like, oh, buck up, idiot. It's a very odd and I think very non-21st century idea of interpersonal relations.
Right, Cameron.
Continuing with this topic of would you let kids have it? You raised points, Rebecca, about it being really quite nasty, actually. However, I think if my hypothetical children were to read it, I'd be just happy that they were reading. I think that is a bit of a rarity now. I would like to think that they would be independent enough to make their own decision from reading it.
And I don't think that unpleasant kind of behaviour necessarily puts kids off. And it's a bit like Roald Dahl, even though I would say he obviously has much more artistic merit. It's the same thing of like, oftentimes adults, they don't really understand the sort of thing that appeals to kids and the sort of thing that puts them off. And that kids actually can be quite dark, and that maybe the darker elements of the books is what's attracting them in some way, that they enjoy that kind of robust, rough and tumble interaction.
I suppose, though, the one difference is Roald Dahl, to an extent, despite not being a terribly pleasant individual himself, has quite a clear moral centre in a funny kind of way in a lot of the books, whereas the Mallory Towers thing, it's almost like the bullies are the heroes sometimes.
Yeah, and I mean, there are two separate objections to Blyton these days, and there is all of the concern around her politics, around her sexism, around her racism. But Rebecca, you also said at the beginning of this segment that her writing just isn't that good, and she's often accused of talking down to children. Meanwhile, something like the Teletubbies was rewarded as being, won awards for being age appropriate. Should we be dumbing things down? Is that part of the problem, that people say Blyton's books just aren't smart enough for 2019?
No, I don't think so. And I think this is another thing. It's like, for one thing, it goes to show that you really can't police what children are, what they are drawn to. And the very fact that, Enid Blyton books keep shifting millions of copies. Well, it's not all parents, palming them off on their disinterested children. Children must be then requesting more and more. But also, why shouldn't kids have guilty pleasures? Why should they be only be pushed towards reading books with literary merit? It's very hypocritical for adults to sit and say, oh, well, they ought to be reading, Swallows and Amazons, and then going off and reading, John Grisham or 50 Shades of Grey on the train.
Rebecca, just coming back to the Royal Mint's decision, what does this say, would you say, about our changing feelings about who gets to be commemorated and who doesn't? And are we going to have a generation going forward of safe choices?
I don't think it is going to affect Blyton's popularity if she is not commemorated with a coin. I think the reason that it upsets people is because it triggers that feeling of, well, if she's racist and I like her books, are you trying to say I'm a racist? I'm not a racist. How dare you call me racist? I think it says more about how the critics of this decision maybe feel about themselves or feel what's being said about them than it does about Blyton, who, after all, is dead. And a commemorative coin is not going to make a difference to her estate's, book profits one way or the other.
Well, quick break for lashings of ginger beer, and we'll be back with one last story after this. And so finally this week, it's John. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
The world's financial operating system needs a reboot.
The strength of a nation's currency is based on the strength of that nation's economy. And the American economy is by far the strongest in the world. Accordingly, I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury to take the action necessary to defend the dollar against the speculators. I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States.
That was Richard Nixon back in 1971. John, what's happened this week and why is Nixon relevant?
The world's central bankers recently met up for their annual shindig, which is in a nice resort called Jackson Hole in Wyoming. Basically, what they do at this annual shindig is they chat about the world's financial system, what's going wrong with it, and how they're going to fix it. Our own Bank of England Governor, Mark Carney, basically stood up and said that US dollar, the core currency at the heart of the financial system, won't be there for all that much longer, and that we need to find something to replace it.
So currently the US dollar is the world's major reserve currency. Can you just explain what that means? What is a reserve currency?
So basically, the reserve currency is a currency that most other countries have a certain amount of faith in. So their central banks will own some of that currency in their reserves. So, in their bank vaults effectively, although it's digital, obviously. And the dollar is the major reserve currency, the global reserve currency. So that just means basically it's the most important currency in the world. And that reflects the fact that the US is the most important economy in the world. It's not always been the US, obviously. At the start of the 1900s, Britain was the dominant power and sterling was the dominant currency, the global reserve currency. 2 world wars basically changed all that. By the end of the Second World War, Europe was thoroughly broke. America was the country with all the money and most of the power. And in 1944, the world's kind of economists and governments sat down at a place called Bretton Woods and basically devised a global monetary system whereby everyone's currency would be tied to the dollar and the dollar would be tied to gold. Now, what we just heard was in 1971, when the US was at war in Vietnam and it was running out of money, the biggest restriction on the US basically printing more money to fund its armies was that the dollar was still tied to gold. So Nixon cut it away from the gold standard, and ever since then we've effectively been living in a post-Bretton Woods US dollar standard world, which is where our currencies kind of all float, but the dollar's the most important one. And that means that if everyone needs dollars, basically, so what happens in the US has a massive impact on the rest of the world.
And so, Rebecca, where do we see the impact of this dollar dependency around the world?
Obviously, the majority of countries, their central banks will hold a certain amount of dollar reserves. And also lots of currencies around the world are pegged to the dollar. And so that means that the decisions that are taken by the US government and by the Federal Reserve will have impacts on those economies around the world. And because the US economy is so influential, most of the time those decisions will make sense for other economies around the world. But if the US decides to do something, that might not be, if you're in a country that has a lot of reserves in dollars, well, the impact of the US decision might not actually work with what is best for your own economy. But because the dollar is so dominant, you obviously don't really have a say in that. And the US, especially under the current administration, is obviously not particularly mindful of the impact that its decisions might have on other countries.
And what does the US get out of being the the world's major reserve currency.
So they do get some tangible economic benefits. They don't pay fees on transactions in the same way because they're trading like in and out of their own currency. But it also has like a tremendous diplomatic advantage. It's really one of the things that kind of cements America's image as like the leader of the world, certainly the leader of the Western world, is that it does have this financial power. So it really does give America a certain amount of clout.
And so obviously this is a long way off, John, because so far it's just a thing that Mark Carney said at a gathering of bankers. But what would the impact of moving away from the US dollar mean for the rest of the world?
Well, I suppose the issue here is that the reserve currency tends to follow what is the most powerful economy, and the obvious rise in power, if you like, is China. The chances are that the renminbi or the yuan, that's the name of the Chinese currency, will become more important and start to displace the dollar, or at least share power with the dollar, if you like. But as Mark Carney kind of points out, you really just then end up swapping one set of problems for another, because instead everyone's dependent on the Chinese currency rather than the US dollar.
And so Carney actually has a different proposal.
He has a cunning plan.
Yes, what's his cunning plan?
This idea is because we now get the technology to digitise currencies, his idea is to have a digital currency that's tied to what they call a basket of major currencies. In other words, it would reflect the value of sterling plus the dollar plus the yuan, probably plus the yen and the euro. So maybe those five would probably make up the basket. And that would mean that basically what it means is that when the US raises interest rates, it wouldn't have as much of an impact on other economies that perhaps aren't ready to raise interest rates. Because one of the big problems, as Rebecca pointed out, is that for smaller economies and developing economies, as soon as the dollar gets very strong, which tends to happen when interest rates go up, money starts to flow to the US. And because of that, it gets sucked out of the smaller economies. And that's a problem, because then it becomes harder for them to fund their own debts, it becomes harder for their companies to get going. Basically, money gets tighter. So it's very destabilising, because they have this constant influx of money when times are good and outflux whenever times are bad. So one of the reasons to try and move away from that is simply to help kind of smaller economies be less kind of destabilised by the way the financial system currently works.
Yeah, and that digital system that Carney's talking about sort of sounds a bit like Facebook's Libra, right, Cam? It's kind of a cryptocurrency, but not quite a cryptocurrency. Some people, though, have said, why couldn't you use an actual cryptocurrency as a reserve currency? What would the problems with that be?
Well, it does share some similarities with Libra coin. So Libra is Facebook's cryptocurrency that it's going to be introducing next year, basically to help people transfer money abroad and also spend money on its social media platforms. The actual coin itself is pegged to a mix between the dollar and the euro, and I believe the pound as well. So it's kind of meant to straddle the line between the two of them, which is kind of what Kearney has proposed here. Some are saying that you could tag it onto an actual cryptocurrency like Bitcoin or Ethereum. So the benefits of that is you're taking the power away from a government or multiple governments, because they are self-regulated essentially. So let's say if I were to look at it and you had multiple governments being involved in a cryptocurrency, I think you're transferring the problem once again from fiat to a digital platform, but you're not really. I still think the problem would be there, because you've got one power that's controlling it all. Introduce a cryptocurrency and you strip that power away from the governments. But the governments won't like that, so they're not going to invest in it.
John, what do you think of that?
Yeah, no, I mean, you're right. That's the point of cryptocurrency, and in a way, this is like the anti-cryptocurrency, because cryptocurrency takes, as you say, power of issuing currency away from governments. One of the things that people like about it, I mean, it was set up in the wake of 2008 as a kind of, if you like, libertarian anarcho-capitalist solution to the fact that a lot of people felt, and which I feel is quite right, basically, that mismanagement by central banks and governments had kind of led us to the 2008 financial crisis. So there's a way of trying to take power away from those kind of centralised institutions. This is, if you like, kind of the central banks realising, and they do realise this because they're not stupid, they understand that cryptocurrencies are a real challenge to government power, actually, because if you can't control your country's currency, then you suddenly don't have, that is a massive tool of social control, economic control. The reason that we use sterling is because we pay our taxes in sterling. That's ultimately the thing that props the pound up. It's the thing that props the euro up, the dollar up, all the rest of it. Whereas the cryptocurrency, the idea is purely the scarcity that keeps it valuable. So basically anyone that kind of hands over power to crypto is handing over a lot of political power.
Obviously, the last time a big shift like this happened, things got pretty dicey, and it was actually quite a painful move post-World War One. I mean, is it going to be equally painful the next time such a shift occurs?
You would hope not, and Carney pointed out in his speech that whenever we're at this kind of transition point, that's traditionally when things like wars and social breakdown have happened, and that's partly reflected in, it's one reason why interest rates are so low around the world just now. And obviously the reason that things are changing partly is because China is the rising power, and we are seeing more tension, we're seeing more global trade tensions. The nice thing, or the optimistic thing, I suppose, is that we're sort of talking about Bretton Woods 2.0 before we've got to the end of the Second World War, it's before we've started on anything like that. So I'm kind of hopeful that we won't need to get to anything as turbulent as that. But ultimately, this is about a handover of power or a change of power. And changes of power are always, always, always tricky and messy and traumatic, because what is it? Power is never given, it's taken.
To an extent, a topic like this can sound a bit esoteric and
Absolutely.
niche, but does it have a real world impact on people? And should it have an impact on their thinking about their investments, the way that they manage their own money?
Yeah, I mean, this is massive, really. You're kind of talking about the tectonic plates underneath most of our social structure. Ultimately, most of us don't really think about what money is, and even economists struggle to define what it is. And ultimately, it's kind of a social technology. And we're now, as I say, we're kind of moving from one operating system, which is full of bugs, to another one, which will be equally full of bugs. As far as your investments go, the one thing I always talk about is having, and this, just to be clear, this is general advice rather than specific advice, etc. But one reason that people own gold in their portfolios is because gold is one of the oldest forms of money, and it's not dependent upon the backing of any government. It just is rock that looks pretty. And generally, in any circumstance, it will be deemed to have value of some sort. And other than that, there's lots of things you can do.
But mainly invest in gold.
But mainly invest in some gold. Have some gold in your portfolio.
So for more on your feelings about the shifting tectonic plates of the global financial system and other kinds of alarmism, where can people get more of this, John?
You'll get some quality alarmism at the Money Week Wealth Summit on November the 22nd in London. Go to the Money Week website or moneyweekwealthsummit.co.uk and you can pick up your ticket there. I would hurry, actually, we're selling out fast. And yeah, it's a full day. Get your breakfast and your lunch and drinks afterwards, so you can come and chat to me about gold and other things.
And that's it from this edition of The Week Unwrapped. My thanks to Rebecca Gillie, John Stepek and Cameron Tait. And you can subscribe to this podcast for 0 bitcoins. It's totally free, and hear new episodes every 7 days. Just search for The Week Unwrapped on your podcast app of choice. Also, don't forget about our live show on October the 5th. Ollie and the team will be appearing as part of the Podcast Live Politics event in central London. For tickets, go to podcastlive.com and use Week 10, that's WEEK10, at checkout for a 10% discount on the ticket price. I've been Arion McNicoll. Our music is by Tom Morby. The producer was Sarah Miles at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week,